I'm Jonny Richardson-Glenn. I'm Chief Officer of Healthy Minds. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about some of the changing context around the voluntary and community sector in Calderdale and more widely. Things are changing all around us, and it's stuff that organisations like Healthy Minds need to be aware of and need to plan for. That's what I'm going to be covering in the rest of this. So first of all, if we look at put all of this into a bit of context, what's the VCS worth in West Yorkshire? So across West Yorkshire, there are 5,700 organisations. When we're talking organisations here, we're talking about registered charities. There are other organisations such as community groups and sports clubs and things like that. But here we're talking about charities specifically. So in the charity sector, there are 31,000 employees and 126,000 regular volunteers. That comes to 9 million hours of work. And if you put a value onto that, we're looking at somewhere between 89 and 126 million. So you can see there's a lot of worth in the sector. And remember, here we are only talking about West Yorkshire. So if you apply that nationally, of course, we're talking a much greater value. Healthy Minds, like most organisations, confines its work to a local authority. So about 70% of VCS organisations, like Healthy Minds, work within the context of a local authority area. So obviously for us, that's Calderdale. But you can see there that the bulk of the work in the voluntary sector is about local neighbourhoods, local places and local populations. So one of the things that is changing in all of this is that the NHS long-term plan has made a commitment to working with the voluntary sector, particularly in relation to providing support for people in communities and around health and well-being. So this is something that is changing, whereby many NHS and local authority commissioners may have had a positive view towards the voluntary sector over many years. But this is something that's really enshrined as a commitment in the NHS long-term plan. So that is something that marks a significant change and something, again, that we need to be prepared for. Healthy Minds is one organisation that's been involved in all of those discussions. So, for example, with the mental health transformation, we're going to talk a bit more about that later. Healthy Minds is one of 8 organisations that was invited to be around the table and discuss the possibilities with NHS England. So, yes, we are part of the discussion and how these things develop. Okay, so let's look at what all of that means in the local context, so for Calderdale and for Healthy Minds. Okay, so we've got NHS England, so they basically set the priorities and they hold the money. In the ICS, the Integrated Care System that Calderdale comes under is West Yorkshire. So in West Yorkshire, that's where they will make the decisions about how the priorities that NHS England have set are going to be met in West Yorkshire. So part of the jargon that has been come into play with all of this is places. So these are the areas within West Yorkshire that come under this ICS. So each of these is called a place. So we've got Wakefield, Leeds, Bradford, Kirklees, and of course the one that concerns us for the purposes of this, Calderdale. So in Calderdale, the integrated care system, so the local version of this is Calderdale Cares Partnership. So this is what people might used to describe as the Clinical Commissioning Group, CCG, but the Calderdale Cares Partnership also includes the local authority and bodies representing the GPs and voluntary sector. So Calderdale is broken down into neighbourhoods, and there are these 5 areas across Calderdale. So everything in the Calderdale borough will come under the boundaries of these neighbourhoods. Okay, for looking at how Healthy Minds relates to this, then we have the Community Health and Wellbeing team. So there are teams connected with each of these neighbourhoods. We've got workers plugged into these neighbourhoods, and this is something that is directly commissioned by Calderdale Cares Partnership in order to meet the community mental health transformation bit. So NHS England have decided that there should be community mental health transformation. In West Yorkshire, they've decided how they're going to go about that. So very broad terms around all of that. And then in each of the places, they've been able to decide how they're going to put these decisions into play. In Calderdale, one of those elements is the Community Health and Wellbeing team. But that's not the only thing that is currently commissioned through the Cares Partnership. We've also got Safe Space. We've got Link, which is the intensive one-to-one support. We've got Like Mind, which is our peer support and befriending. And we've got Time Out, the Children and Young Persons Service. So these are all directly commissioned by Calderdale Cares Partnership these days. So you can see there that the services that Healthy Minds has are sort of growing or better linked to some of the strategic stuff that is coming, its origins in NHS England. So we also feed in to this process. So whilst we have services that are commissioned that sort of deliver on some of these things, we actually also have some influence on some of the decisions that are made. So for example, there's a West Yorkshire VCS mental health group. This brings voluntary sector organisations who work in mental health from all of these places together. I am at the moment the chair of that group. So in here, we'll talk about how some of these decisions are working out across the places, what sort of challenges are being met, and what sorts of other developments are happening around all of this, what we're hearing from communities and from other services. And then that gets fed back in to the West Yorkshire ICS so that we're able to influence some of those decisions from the voluntary sector's point of view. Okay, so there are some challenges that all organisations in the voluntary sector face. So we're going to look at some of those now. Firstly, we're going to look at the sort of just the whole sector, the national picture really, and then we'll get into a bit more specific to Calderdale. So one of the things that all organisations are encountering now is difficulties with staff recruitment and retention. So people coming into the voluntary sector, but also staying in the voluntary sector, and there's lots of different reasons that that is becoming a bit more difficult. One of those is that historically, the voluntary sector has almost a tradition of accepting commissioning contracts that don't actually cover the real costs of delivering those services. So a commissioner might say, I have X amount of money and I would like you to do this job with it. It doesn't always necessarily cover the costs, particularly when we're in a sort of, inflationary pressures and things like that. So services cost more to run, but the money that comes into them doesn't increase accordingly. One of the consequences of that is we get lower pay in the voluntary sector compared to some other sectors. It means that organisations can't invest as much as they would like in staff training and development. So again, the sort of bigger pieces of research show that relatively low percentages of organisations have the training budgets that they would like to have. Also, the concept that staff and volunteers in the voluntary sector always go the extra mile. This is an unspoken expectation that research has found is wearing thin. So the question is sort of being asked, why should we always go the extra mile when we get precious few rewards for doing that? This is all in the context of growing mental health needs. So there's more demand on services than there's ever been, which means that services are under more pressure. Lots of different reasons for this. Mental health is more widely discussed in society these days. There's a bit less stigma around it. It means that some people more readily identify as having mental health needs than perhaps did in years gone by. That puts extra demand onto the services. It isn't being met in the NHS. So where that isn't being met, it comes into the voluntary sector. And of course, again, going back to the idea that commissioning and contracts doesn't always necessarily cover the costs, we might be going back a year or two where demand looked a little bit different. But despite the fact that demand has changed, we're still trying to meet the demand. The resource hasn't necessarily increased to go along with that. So there's extra pressure on all services, and of course then the staff working in those services. And uncertainty is a big characteristic of the voluntary sector. Funding tends to be short term, so it might be 12 months, it might be 2 years, 3 years is something of a luxury. That means that there's always this ongoing uncertainty. You can't necessarily plan ahead with any great certainty about what's going to happen. It means that staff don't know how long they have the jobs for, and then may leave that service in order to get a bit more job security elsewhere. And all of those things come together that mean that despite the fact that a service might be really valued in a community, it becomes at risk. For one thing, it might not have the money to keep it going, but the other means that the staff who have formed that service are part of its identity, may move on. And then, of course, that creates a bit of a different challenge in how you keep that service going. Locally, then, in addition to these national issues that we've just looked at, there are some extra things to consider in Calderdale. So one of those things is that Calderdale gets less funding compared to the other areas in West Yorkshire. If we think back to the 5 places, Calderdale gets the smallest slice of the pie across West Yorkshire compared to all of those other places. There are different reasons for that, and one is that the funding tends to be linked to the size of the population. Calderdale has a smaller population, but actually quite a large geographical area. So we've got a big borough with a thinly spread population. And what that means is there's an extra challenge in an organisation like Healthy Minds trying to cover the whole Calderdale borough with less of a resource. So that creates a bit of a challenge around that. And perhaps as a consequence, there is a higher mental health prevalence in Calderdale than there is nationally. So in other words, more people report having mental health problems in Calderdale than they do in the rest of England. And similarly, there's a higher suicide rate than there is nationally. Calderdale has among the highest suicide rates in the country. So the particular challenges that come with that in terms of what services are and what services do, where that work is best targeted. And then there's a complex picture, but all of this sort of creates really stark health inequalities in Calderdale. So between the distance of a mile or even half a mile in some of the wards in the borough, you could be looking at life expectancy that's 7 or more years different. Of course, we know that some communities are less well served than others. All sorts of different issues in there, but the challenge we have is that there are some really big health inequalities in Calderdale, and of course that's something else that we need to think about. Okay, so if we look at how some of this stuff is playing out specifically in Healthy Minds, so we can look here at our income sources. So I've gone back here to 2011. That was sort of when we started to get the most significant funding and had to do a different type of financial reporting. So the yellow lines here show the total income. That's the income from all sources in that particular year. So you can see there, it started back here in 2011. I think our income then was something like 25,000 for the whole year. And that has sort of gone up and down a little bit, but the overall trend is that it's been going up. So we went over 1.4 million in 2022, and we're looking at something like 1.3 million in 2023. Now, the light blue lines show the expenditure. So the yellow is the money coming in and the blue is the money going out. So again, here you can see that there's been quite a bit of variation in all of that, but pretty much we are close to the expenditure matching the income. So where it tends to be a bigger difference, that's because there's some money that has come in this year, but it actually relates to the following year. So you can see here that part of the challenge we've got is 2023, whilst expenditure is just lower than income, there isn't a whole lot of headroom to go at in there. So that's a particular challenge. We need to look carefully at where the money is going and what's coming in. Then the orange lines here are grants. So these are grants from statutory sources. So that might be the local authority or it might be the NHS. And over the previous years, the grant funding has sort of been an increasing part of our income. Going up to 2022, where we were looking at quite a significant part. And then in this current year, that's plunged right down, but that is because the green line, which is contracts, so contracts has sort of replaced the grant funding. So essentially, it's a different contracting arrangement. So what you're saying is, for a grant, you get X amount of money with a certain expectation that comes with it. A contract is a little bit different insofar as there's more of a process to go through with that and a bit more sort of responsibility and liability that comes with it. In other words, you have to deliver on a contract and that is more scrutinized. What's good about that is that it's a sort of changing relationship with the NHS. So we're going to look at that a wee bit more. And this is contracts and grants as a percentage of our total income. So the white line here is contracts. So you can see we basically didn't really have any contracts until fairly recently. The grants, however, go back a little bit, and we've sort of had some grant income over the years. The dip here is explained because this grant was to cover both years. So we effectively had a grant in that year, it just wasn't income. But you can see there that there has been a sort of grants have been a part of our income throughout there, but then it plummets here, but that's because contracting has become a more significant part of what we do. So it's 77% of our income in the past year was through contracts. This has changed the way that organisations like Healthy Minds run. So there are two types of income sources that all of that relates to. And the first of those is restricted. Restricted can only be used for the agreed purpose. So we might have a grant or we might have a contract, and that will specify how the money must be spent. And you really don't have any flexibility around that. The other bit is unrestricted. Now, unrestricted in this context doesn't mean that there is no limit to it. What it means is it doesn't have the restrictions around how it can be spent. So unrestricted income gives us a lot more flexibility if we know that there is a need in the organisation, if we know that there are going to be gaps in funding, for example, we might be able to bridge that gap with unrestricted income. Or it means that we can develop some new ideas. If we see that there's a need somewhere and we want to do something with that, we can be a little bit more innovative and experimental with that. So unrestricted income gives us a lot more flexibility in how money is spent. However, about 89% of Healthy Minds income is restricted. So that comes through contracts or grants and has a specified purpose. So this is where we get a scenario that, for example, we may have run out of money for a specific service. And even though we have income for other services, we're not allowed to use that against the service that is at risk of closure. So this is where we get a scenario where we have to perhaps close down one service at the same time that we're advertising and launching a new service. Okay, so if we look a wee bit more about unrestricted income, so one of the main sources of unrestricted income is through donations and community fundraising. So if we look here at how that picture has changed over the years, you can see there that whilst for quite a while now we've had a certain level of income through donations, it has actually become a much greater part of the overall picture in more recent years. And perhaps that's best illustrated if we look at the next slide. Okay, so this shows we've averaged out the income over the years, so you can sort of get a different sense of what that percentage looks like. So you can see here with the orange that the percentage of our overall income that has come through fundraising and donations has quite significantly increased. So in the past year, we're looking at over 10% of our income coming through the public donations and through people doing fundraising for us. And that's significant. The part of the reason that's significant is it's unrestricted income. It gives us that flexibility so that we can better manage perhaps more difficult times. So it is important that we find ways to increase the income that we have as unrestricted. That just gives us a bit more resilience as an organization. Okay, so looking at service demand then, of course, putting the services together and being able to fund them is all well and good, but there has to be a point to it. Um, so the number of beneficiaries, so there's lots of different terms that people use around this. So it might be service users or customers or participants. But for the purposes of this, we're going to use the term beneficiary. So it's people who benefit from the service. So you can see on here, pre-COVID, across all of Healthy Mind services, we were just about at the 8,500 mark. The very noticeable drop here comes in from the COVID pandemic. We obviously had to change a lot of the way that services were operating. We weren't able to meet face to face. So although we had much lower numbers through the pandemic, that was a lot more intensive work. So we were working far more closely with the people who were already connected with Healthy Minds. But since that has eased up, we're sort of starting to build back up again. And of course, we've got a difference here between um, the previous 2 years. The difference perhaps there can be explained by the closure of recovery and support, which obviously meant that we weren't able to maintain the same level of activity. But if we look at one specific service, so Time Out, our children and young people service, we can sort of see that pre-pandemic, they were achieving very healthy numbers. But during the pandemic, like everywhere else, the numbers dropped way down, and that was because a large part of the delivery involves going into schools and delivering sessions in classrooms, which of course couldn't happen. But you can see there that the numbers are building back up. So it won't be long before they're back up at the sort of pre-COVID levels. So you can see that there is that sort of recovery as people are re-engaging with services again. So all of this is well and good, and we can sit back and sort of be at the mercy of all of these changes in the landscape and sit back and wait and see what happens. But we don't want to do that. So we actually have a strategy that will take us over the next few years and respond to some of those changes and some of those challenges that we've just been talking about. So one of those is to have the financial and organizational structures to ensure sustainability. So part of that is knowing that knowing what money we have and what money we need, looking at the capacity in services. So looking at the demand that we've got, do we have the team with the right capacity, with the skills and experience to be able to deliver what those services want to achieve? And then having identified those things, do we have strategies to sort of say, right, here's what we're going to do about that? And the answer is yes, we do. And we've got that we want to provide services and deliver projects that most effectively meet the needs of the population. So part of this is knowing what those needs are. So that's having discussions with communities. That's looking at some of the research locally and nationally, doing some of the research ourselves, and then doing the co-production around that, involving people in what could respond best to those needs. Health inequalities, we talked about that earlier. There's a big health inequality picture in Calderdale. So part of what we want to do is to understand those so that we can try to design ways to address some of those things. And then delivery is about making sure that we're doing the right things in the right ways with the right people, the right times, in the right places. So again, it's just making sure that we're actually providing what people want. So providing it is all well and good, but we also need to maintain and further develop the services. In order to do that, we need to be able to evidence that this stuff works. So those people who have been involved with services might recognize that we often ask people to do things like well-being measures. We ask for feedback and case studies and stuff like this. This is because it all builds the evidence. It shows that what we're doing actually makes a difference. And that means that it's far more likely to continue if we're able to show that it works. In order to do that, we need to be better at the reporting side of things. So we always have to report to funders because they want to know what's happening with their money. But we want to get better at reporting to the public. We want to get better at sort of shouting about what we do and the difference that it makes. So this is where telling people comes into it. We want to be a bit more visible about all of that sort of stuff so that people know what we do and what difference it makes, and then might want to sort of get on board with it. And then also to maintain our profile as a trusted, reputable and influential mental health provider in Calderdale. As showed earlier, how Healthy Minds is among the organisations that has influenced some of the decisions that are being made around mental health and in the health service, and we want to carry on with that. So publicity is part of this. So again, people need to know that we're here. If they need us in terms of needing the support that Healthy Minds provides, or wanting to actually support us themselves in terms of fundraising or getting involved as a volunteer or those sorts of things. Membership. So we're having lots of sort of recent discussions about membership. We want to grow a membership base. So this is a chance for people to become members of Healthy Minds, partly to show support, but also it means that we can sort of just spread the word so people can kind of tell people what Healthy Minds is and what it's about. The forum then is an opportunity for people who have that sort of experience with services to share that with us, and then we can help sort of put that voice forward. We can talk to people who make the decisions about this stuff. We can kind of say, this is what people are telling us is needed in mental health. This is what's working. This is what's missing, and we can actually convey that to those people who make decisions so that they're making them from a really informed point of view. And that's that influence then, being part of those discussions and making sure that we're in there, that we're representing people, we're saying that we've got good services, they're making this difference, and actually, you know, promoting that as an idea, because perhaps other people can learn from what we're doing, and we can learn from them. Okay, so that's it. We've found out some of the changes and challenges that organizations like Healthy Minds are facing. I would just encourage people to continue to be part of the conversation from this point. And if you've got any questions, ask us. We'll do our best to answer them. Thank you.